Nancy Harper had spent the better part of her life resolving other people's conflicts. As a professional civil mediator, she was known for her even tone, her composure, and her ability to find common ground where others saw only walls. In her career, she had sat across from business owners ready to sue each other into oblivion, couples fighting over shared property lines, even families divided over inheritance disputes. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't flinch, and she didn't lose. But for the first time in decades, she found herself on the opposite side of the table, and it wasn't a courtroom or an office, it was her own front porch. The trouble began not with a bang, but with an envelope. It was taped to her door, flapping lightly in the wind like a careless afterthought, but its contents were anything but trivial. According to the letter, Nancy had violated local zoning guidelines tied to her backyard structure, an old greenhouse she'd upgraded over the summer, and now faced financial penalties and the potential for forced removal if she didn't respond within 10 days. The letter was unsigned, carried no clear identification of the sender beyond a vague committee reference, and provided no return address or phone number. Still, it cited a review board ruling and accused her of encroaching into what they referred to as a shared boundary zone, which didn't exist on her original land survey or deed. Nancy had lived in her home for over 12 years, paid her property taxes early, filed every improvement permit by the book, and even sat on the neighborhood review panel for a brief stint back in 2016. There had never been an issue until now. Puzzled but not panicked, she did what any rational person would. She contacted Ryan Kelly, her longtime legal advisor, to draft a formal appeal. Ryan was measured, methodical, and especially good at dealing with local disputes. He reassured her this was likely a clerical error, something that could be resolved quickly with the right documentation and tone. Nancy collected all necessary permits, photos of the greenhouse's footprint, copies of utility records, and historic zoning charts, and they filed a response to the accusation within 48 hours. She expected silence or maybe a delayed correction from the committee. Instead, what she received next shattered her expectations entirely. Just 4 days after the appeal was filed, Ryan called her, not with updates or questions, but with a confession. He had been informed by his firm that he was being forcibly recused from Nancy's case due to a conflict of interest stemming from a case he handled years ago, one involving a property developer who once had ties to the zoning commission. Ryan was blindsided. The developer was no longer active, the matter was settled out of court, and it had no legal overlap with Nancy's current dispute. But the order came from his firm's internal ethics committee, and he had no say. The subtext was clear. He was being pulled off the case not because he'd done something wrong, but because someone didn't want him on it at all. Nancy didn't panic, but something shifted. This wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. This was deliberate. Someone didn't just want her greenhouse gone. They wanted her defenseless. She'd spent her life guiding people away from paranoia and emotional thinking, but this wasn't about emotion. This was about leverage. Someone was tightening a noose, one clause and technicality at a time, and for the first time in her life, Nancy Harper wasn't negotiating for someone else's peace. She was preparing for her own war. Nancy didn't sleep that night. The phone call from Ryan replayed in her mind like a glitching loop, each repetition peeling back another layer of concern, until what began as a nuisance started to resemble something closer to a calculated offensive. Her lawyer had been pulled out from under her without a chance to object, and no replacement was offered. The excuse, flimsy as it was, had been delivered by his firm with the subtlety of a threat, something along the lines of, "It's in your best interest to accept this decision quietly." Ryan had tried to soften it, of course. He said he'd help her find another attorney, someone outside the jurisdiction, someone unaffected by local politics. But even as he said it, they both understood what it meant. Nancy was no longer dealing with a zoning issue. She was being maneuvered, and whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to force her into compliance. They wanted her isolated, preferably discredited. The following morning, she drove downtown to the city office where zoning appeals were officially recorded. It was a modern building with bright signage and glass doors that reflected a crisp September sky. She wasn't expecting resistance, at least not there. She simply wanted to see the complaint in its original form, retrieve the official maps and documentation cited, and verify who had filed it. At the front desk, she was met with the kind of performative politeness that often masks obstruction. The clerk, a young man with a buzz cut and an apologetic smile, said he couldn't release the original filing without supervisor approval. When Nancy asked to speak with that supervisor, she was told the person was unavailable for the rest of the week. She asked if she could submit a formal request for access, and the clerk handed her a form with a signature line at the bottom that read, "Document access may be denied at discretion of zoning oversight." That was the moment Nancy's heart began to truly race. Back home, she scanned through her property records again, this time comparing old and new zoning overlays. Something had changed. An obscure clause marked in red indicated a recent revision. Something referred to as boundary buffering protocol, apparently implemented just 6 months earlier, allowing review boards to redefine the neutral land between properties for ecological purposes. The language was vague, and it included terms like conditional encroachment and passive boundary reinterpretation. It was written in a way that only made sense to lawyers or those hoping to hide something. What chilled her wasn't the legalese itself, but the timing. That language had not existed when she began her greenhouse upgrades. She pulled out her permit approvals, dated and stamped, and they predated the new clause by nearly a year, which meant that her structure had been approved legally under the rules that existed at the time. But now they were trying to rewrite the rules retroactively and punish her for not following a future she couldn't have predicted. She contacted Ryan again, not for help, he'd already been cut off, but to ask if he had seen similar tactics in other cases. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, he said carefully. He had seen something like this before, but not often. There had been whispers of a coordinated effort to gently discourage homeowners from retaining legal counsel in disputes tied to green zoning and community easements. Usually the pressure came from inside the firms themselves, senior partners receiving calls from people in city planning, asking why a certain case was being challenged so aggressively. The understanding was unspoken, but undeniable. Withdraw quietly, or find yourself unwelcome in future business. Ryan didn't name names, but Nancy knew he wasn't just speculating. She asked if the firm had faced pressure about her case. After a pause, he confirmed it. There was a call, he admitted. Off the record. About you. I wasn't supposed to tell you that. That admission turned her stomach. She had always believed the system, while flawed, still ran on some foundation of process. But this wasn't process, it was orchestration, and that changed everything. She couldn't count on forms, hearings, or quiet resolutions anymore. So she started asking around. She reached out to 2 neighbors who had installed similar greenhouse structures, though theirs were smaller, and neither had received citations. One of them, a woman named Grace, mentioned something odd. Her husband had received a friendly advisory note last month suggesting they keep their greenhouse under a certain size. It wasn't an official complaint, just a note, typed, no name. And that note arrived 3 days before Nancy's violation letter was posted. Grace hadn't thought much of it, but now, connecting the timing, it seemed less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Within a week, Nancy learned of 4 other homeowners in the surrounding blocks who'd faced minor citations, all tied to structural boundaries or ecological intrusions. In each case, those who contested the fines found their appeals delayed, dismissed, or redirected through technicalities. In one case, a man named Lucas had his hearing canceled entirely after his lawyer missed a submission window, due to incorrect scheduling provided by the review board. Another, a retired schoolteacher, dropped the case after her attorney was suddenly reassigned by her firm. None of them fought beyond that. The message was clear: push back, and you'll find yourself without help. Nancy realized she was not being singled out randomly. She was part of a quiet, targeted strategy. A campaign. She began keeping a written log of every interaction, every call, every letter, every inconsistency. She documented the dates, the names used, the language of the accusations. She also made an appointment with a legal ethics advisor unaffiliated with any of the firms involved, hoping to understand what recourse she had if attorneys were being systematically forced out. The advisor told her frankly that unless someone was willing to testify and risk their own career, there would be no proof of coercion. The system didn't leave fingerprints. Then, as if to confirm that she had crossed a line just by asking the wrong questions, Nancy received a notice in her mailbox with a new accusation: unauthorized surveillance. Apparently, someone had reported that she had installed cameras facing a public access zone. No such zone existed. The camera in question was the same motion light-activated model she had installed on her garage 2 years prior. It hadn't been moved or adjusted. The accusation had no merit. But it didn't matter. It meant someone was watching her, not just procedurally, but physically, waiting for her to make a wrong move, or at least inventing one if she didn't. Nancy had been maneuvered. Her lawyer had been stripped away under a fabricated conflict of interest. The system she'd once trusted to operate under rules and fairness was suddenly acting more like a trap than a safeguard. And now, even her quiet, careful efforts to protect her own home were being twisted into violations. But she wasn't naive. She knew exactly what this was now. A strategy built not on open confrontation, but on erosion, of resources, of credibility, of resolve. It was never about the greenhouse. It was about control. And if they wanted to break her down piece by piece, they'd find out what happened when they picked a fight with someone who'd built their entire life out of holding conflict together. Nancy's decision to press forward, even without a lawyer, wasn't one made in haste or arrogance. It was made with the steely pragmatism of someone who had spent their life reading subtext, recognizing quiet hostility, and understanding that some battles were won not by shouting louder, but by simply refusing to step back. She knew what this was now, an orchestrated campaign of pressure designed to disorient, isolate, and ultimately exhaust her into compliance. But she also knew something else. Once you make yourself hard to isolate, once you demonstrate that you're not frightened into retreating just because someone removes your support, the people pulling the strings tend to overplay their hand. Nancy's plan was simple. Expose the pattern, force transparency, and document everything so meticulously that the truth could not be denied, even if no one was willing to say it aloud. The first step in that plan was data. Unemotional, factual, time-stamped data. She filed formal records requests under the Public Access Act, seeking internal zoning board correspondence and review logs for the past 18 months. The requests were worded carefully, with dates and case identifiers tied to her own file and those of neighbors she had spoken to. Legally, they couldn't deny the request without cause. Predictably, though, the delays began immediately. 2 separate filings were acknowledged but not fulfilled. One was misfiled due to a clerical error. Another was returned because it allegedly lacked proper verification, despite being submitted via certified channel. Meanwhile, her neighbors began to notice subtle shifts as well. Grace told her that their garbage collection was missed 2 weeks in a row, despite other houses on the same street being serviced normally. Lucas received an anonymous letter accusing him of violating urban noise thresholds, even though he lived alone and didn't own speakers. Nancy saw it all for what it was: psychological warfare through mundane disruptions, small indignities engineered to chip away at people's patience and sense of normalcy. Despite the chaos around her, Nancy remained clinical in her approach. She compiled a color-coded incident report system at home. breaking down every violation, complaint, delay, or unexplained contact into categories. She then mapped those data points against the timeline of zoning rule changes and the corresponding property disputes in the area. Patterns emerged. The new enforcement clause, the so-called Buffer Zone Realignment Initiative, had only been aggressively applied after a new subcommittee was quietly introduced. The subcommittee itself had been approved during an off-cycle meeting with only 3 members in attendance, none of whom lived in the affected neighborhoods. That, in itself, was not illegal, but it was unethical. And in Nancy's hands, it was ammunition. Her documentation efforts did not go unnoticed. One morning, as she stepped outside to check her mailbox, she noticed a plain white envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. It wasn't mailed, had no return address, and simply read enough in thick black marker across the front. Inside was a single photocopied article, an old court case involving a man who had been fined into foreclosure after pushing back against a similar zoning conflict. The message was unsubtle. Nancy didn't flinch. She added it to the log, scanned it, photographed it, and notified the local police. Not because she expected them to act, but to ensure there was a formal record of intimidation, should the situation escalate further. And escalate it did. Within days of submitting her 3rd formal public records request, this time through a county-level intermediary, Nancy received a notice scheduling a surprise property compliance inspection. The timing was deliberate. The letter was dated 2 days earlier but delivered at 6:47 a.m. on the morning of the inspection itself. She had no time to prepare, no chance to respond or reschedule. 3 inspectors arrived at 7:30 a.m. Sharp, wearing city-issued badges and carrying clipboards that looked more performative than official. They took photos without explanation, poked through her landscaping, and measured arbitrary distances from her shed to the edge of her fence. One of them, a man in his 60s with a clipped tone, asked if she had made any changes to underground irrigation or drainage in the past 12 months. Nancy, stunned but composed, asked for clarification, noting that her property had no irrigation system beyond a rainwater collector. He didn't respond. He simply wrote something down, then moved on. After they left, Nancy discovered a small orange sticker affixed to her utility panel. Pending review, water displacement compliance. It sounded official. It wasn't. The sticker had no city insignia, no contact number, no citation code. It was a prop, a way to generate fear and confusion without legal consequence. But to someone less aware, it would have been enough to trigger panic. Nancy took a picture, removed the sticker, filed a complaint, and posted the image to a private forum for local property owners that she had recently joined. Within hours, 3 other users posted identical stickers that had appeared on their panels in the past week. None of them had been given explanations. None had inspectors who left documentation. They were all facing zoning disputes. That evening, Nancy's power went out. No storms, no neighborhood outage, just her. The utility company, when contacted, stated there had been a scheduled maintenance order for Address Grid Node 71, which, as it turned out, wasn't her assigned node. She asked who submitted the work order. The operator told her it had come through a third-party compliance authority. That phrase rang alarm bells. No one could explain what authority that was. She pressed, was transferred, then told she would need to file a written inquiry for any further information. Nancy didn't panic. She didn't shout or storm into an office. Instead, she quietly contacted an administrative law professor she had met years ago at a conflict resolution seminar. The woman, Dr. Salazar, agreed to meet over coffee, intrigued more by the systemic nature of the abuse than by Nancy's personal story. Nancy brought copies of her logs, incident photos, zoning overlays, and copies of communication records. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, Dr. Salazar's tone had shifted from academic curiosity to alarm. "You're not the only one," she said quietly. "This kind of selective enforcement wrapped in procedural ambiguity. It's spreading. You're just the first to push back with a paper trail." Together, they devised a new approach. Nancy would continue documenting, but now she'd begin channeling her findings through institutional channels that couldn't be quietly sabotaged. Legal observers, academic liaisons, and watchdog nonprofits. She also arranged for a third-party legal review of her property boundaries and zoning classification, completely independent with forensic documentation to back it. If they wanted to drown her in process, she'd beat them at their own game. But that same week, one of her neighbors, a quiet man named Evan, who had recently joined a zoning hearing in support of her, was cited for operating a non-compliant workshop structure in his backyard. It was a garden shed. He'd had it for 8 years. Nancy visited Evan, who looked exhausted. "I didn't even know what a buffer zone was until you told me," he said. "Now they're telling me I have to pay a $2,000 administrative fee just to schedule an appeal." Nancy left his house feeling the weight of the campaign expanding. This wasn't about her greenhouse. This wasn't about one structure. It was a calculated, quiet purge of resistance, designed to bleed people until they gave in or gave up. And Nancy Harper wasn't about to do either. By the third week of active resistance, Nancy found herself navigating not just a campaign of technical sabotage and procedural stonewalling, but a growing awareness that her situation was no longer confined to legal gray areas and administrative ambiguity. It had evolved into something altogether more calculated and predatory, an engineered strategy built to wear down individuals through layers of isolation, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Still, Nancy remained methodical. She had long known that institutions, when challenged, often responded not with brute force, but with red tape so intricately spun that it suffocated opposition without leaving a single visible bruise. But she also knew the power of precision, and the moment her adversaries realized she wasn't going to fold quietly, they began making mistakes. The first real breakthrough came not from a legal win, but from a clerical oversight, an internal scheduling document that had been sent to her in error when she filed a third appeal through the city's zoning portal. The attachment, embedded in a generic response email, listed upcoming review hearings and notations about anticipated outcomes. Next to her name, under the column labeled Probability, a bolded 90% appeared beside the phrase Denial, Insufficient, Standing. More alarming, though, was the annotation beside it. Previous counsel flagged, direct challenge advised against, expedite case resolution via third channel. Nancy stared at the line for several minutes before printing the entire document, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from recognition. These weren't just notes, they were internal signals. Someone had written, in plain language, that her case was to be routed through a process designed to minimize exposure and eliminate her legal footing as quickly as possible. And previous counsel flagged. That was Ryan. This wasn't theory anymore, it was confirmation. She shared the document with Dr. Salazar, who was now informally advising her and had already involved one of her graduate research teams in quietly tracking the case's broader implications. Salazar was stunned by the bluntness of the note and agreed it was likely not meant to be seen outside the committee. "This is actionable," she said, "but only if it connects directly to a pattern of behavior, not just one mistake." Nancy didn't need to ask what that meant. She was already documenting cases in which homeowners were being coerced, misled, or strategically isolated. But a pattern to be legally useful had to be systemic and traceable. So she shifted her approach. Instead of focusing solely on her own situation, she began triangulating her timeline against those of others she'd connected with, using municipal data, property notices, and enforcement records that, while public, were often buried beneath layers of obscure formatting and incomprehensible metadata. Salazar's students helped structure the information, cross-referencing timestamps, reviewing discrepancies, and plotting enforcement clusters across the district. What emerged was damning. In a 3-month period, over 40 compliance warnings had been issued within a specific 10-block radius, Nancy's radius. The majority were tied to minor violations: planter box height, decorative fencing, storm runoff angles, toolshed placement, and even mailbox color. Many of these issues were never previously enforced, and in some cases, homeowners had received verbal or written permission years prior. The warnings weren't the problem. It was the follow-through. Of those 40, nearly half escalated to fines within 5 days. 12 resulted in appeal attempts, all of which were either dropped, withdrawn, or administratively blocked. 5 had legal representation involved. 3 of those lawyers were dismissed under internal ethical advisement, while the remaining 2 cases were redirected to arbitration hearings with no public transparency. The most telling pattern of all was that in each of those instances, there were notes referring to review optimization, a euphemism used internally for expediting unfavorable resolutions. It wasn't random. It wasn't bureaucratic entropy. It was targeted and curated enforcement. And Nancy had the skeleton of a timeline, a map, and a procedural algorithm to prove it. But that's also when the tone of the harassment changed. No longer content with subtle intimidation or veiled threats, the people behind the scenes began to exploit the gaps in her daily life, exploiting rhythms, not facts. Her trash wasn't picked up 3 weeks in a row. She found her front gate left open repeatedly, despite habitually locking it at night. Her car alarm was triggered twice without cause. Once her mail was rerouted without her request, marked temporary hold, and redirected to a P.O. box she had never authorized. The postal supervisor said it was likely a system glitch. Nancy knew better. Then, during a weekend visit from her sister, a woman Nancy hadn't seen in years, something more invasive occurred. Her sister's rental car was towed from in front of the house despite being parked legally and within visiting hours. When Nancy called the tow company, she was told it had been reported for obstructing regulated access. There was no signage, no barrier, and no ordinance against street parking. When asked who made the call, the operator claimed it was from a neighborhood enforcement liaison. That title didn't exist in city code. Nancy requested the phone number used to place the report. It was blocked. Still, she documented it, added it to the growing file, and pressed forward with her forensic property evaluation, conducted by a team she hired through an external urban planning firm. The report they produced dismantled the entire zoning case against her. Not only was her greenhouse construction well within all historical boundary lines, but the supposed buffer zone policy being cited wasn't even applicable to properties with prior landscape variances, of which she had 3, all documented and approved years earlier. The report concluded with a single declarative line: no existing or amended ordinance invalidates the current structure based on construction date, placement, or environmental impact. With the report in hand, she drafted a formal petition to have the original violation nullified. But even before she could file it, she received a new letter. This one wasn't from the city, but from a private legal firm retained by a neighboring party, claiming that her greenhouse had lowered their property value due to visual encroachment. The complaint was vague, unsubstantiated, and riddled with generalized language about neighborhood character. Nancy immediately suspected who it came from: Karen Brooks, a woman 3 houses down, who had once campaigned against another neighbor's garage extension, citing similar complaints. Karen had a history of weaponizing bylaws, but this time she wasn't acting alone. The letter was authored by a law firm known to represent regional developers and large-scale property management groups. Why would they be involved in a petty neighbor dispute? The answer, Nancy feared, was leverage. Karen, it turned out, had recently sold a portion of her property to an investment group quietly acquiring plots along the corridor. If Nancy's structure remained, it could potentially complicate redevelopment plans, or simply serve as an example of resistance. Her existence was an inconvenience, a symbol. And symbols, when left unchecked, become dangerous to the kind of people who prefer compliance over transparency. Nancy wasn't just trying to keep her greenhouse. She was now the focal point of a conflict rooted in legal exploitation, territorial manipulation, and calculated community engineering. They had removed her lawyer, twisted codes, invented authorities, and turned her street into a slow-motion siege. But what they hadn't done, and what they now feared, was silence her. Because now, Nancy had something more dangerous than resolve. She had evidence, and very soon she would have witnesses. If the midpoint of Nancy's battle revealed the shape of the machine working against her, the next phase was its retaliation. It didn't come as a single blow, but as a sequence of actions so precisely timed and deliberately ambiguous that each event, on its own, might seem incidental, annoying, even unfair, but not overtly malicious. Yet to anyone paying attention, the message was clear. This wasn't just about legal maneuvering anymore. This was about punishment. Someone behind the scenes had decided that Nancy Harper had gone too far. The line had been crossed when she brought in third-party specialists, commissioned forensic property reviews, and began coordinating her findings through an academic legal observer with institutional connections. By attempting to expose the system, she had made herself a threat, not only to those directly involved in her case, but to the broader network of players relying on silence, confusion, and attrition to maintain control. It began subtly. Within 48 hours of submitting her petition to nullify the original violation, backed by the forensic report, Nancy received a notification from her insurance provider. A routine audit, they called it. Upon review of recent municipal complaints and legal filings, her homeowner's insurance was being reevaluated for risk. A representative called to inform her that unless the situation was fully resolved, her premium would likely be raised by 30% at minimum, or her coverage suspended altogether. She asked what had triggered the reevaluation. The rep hesitated, then admitted the inquiry was based on a flagged entry in a third-party database, one that tracks code violations and legal activity at the property level. The violation itself had not been proven valid. But its existence, its record, was enough to generate a classification shift. Nancy, for the first time in her life, was labeled high risk, not because of her behavior, but because she had dared to contest someone else's. At nearly the same time, the private legal firm representing the so-called neighboring party filed a temporary injunction, blocking any further use of the greenhouse pending resolution of their property value grievance. The injunction was laughably weak in substance. It didn't cite any measurable damages or even identify who exactly had submitted the complaint, but it was enough to stall everything. Nancy was now legally barred from using the space she had fought so hard to defend. And that was the strategy, not to beat her in court, but to tie her up so tightly in slow-moving process that her resistance would collapse under its own weight. The psychological pressure mounted quickly. She began receiving vague letters from other entities, utility providers, landscaping services, waste disposal contractors, informing her that the service reviews were underway due to community feedback. One even mentioned a negative impact report, with no details, only a reference number and a direction to follow up via a hotline that led to a pre-recorded menu with no option for human assistance. Her calls to city departments began going unanswered or bounced between offices, each blaming the other for the delay. And all the while, new issues continued to appear on her record, including one particularly absurd notice that claimed she had violated rainwater collection capacity limits, a policy that didn't exist under local code. But the real escalation came not through bureaucratic harassment, but direct community destabilization. Someone, Nancy could only assume under the direction of her adversaries, began going door to door in the neighborhood, warning others that she was escalating legal action against the district, that her fight would raise property taxes, that her battle could delay city services or freeze infrastructure grants for the entire zone. She wasn't suing the city, she wasn't disrupting public funds, and she certainly wasn't risking anyone's services. But rumors, once introduced, have a way of expanding in the minds of those already anxious. Within days, people stopped waving. Neighbors she had spoken to about shared violations declined to return her texts. One woman she had been meeting with weekly, Jane, a retired nurse, sent her a short message apologizing for having to step away from the group effort for family reasons. It was phrased politely, even carefully. But Nancy heard the subtext. Fear. They weren't just trying to isolate her. They were trying to make her a pariah, rebranding her not as a victim of overreach, but as a destabilizing figure. The kind of person whose actions, even when technically valid, become socially radioactive. She was no longer a woman defending her rights. She was being cast as a woman who made life harder for everyone else. And while Nancy understood intellectually that this was part of the strategy, pressure applied through public narrative, she also felt the weight of it in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began sleeping with her phone under her pillow. She kept notes near her bed. She locked all exterior gates by hand, regardless of the time. She stopped making evening walks through the neighborhood, where once she had casually spoken to nearly every household. The space around her, once familiar and lived in, had transformed into a stage of quiet hostility, punctuated by forced smiles and closed curtains. But Nancy wasn't unprepared. She had spent her entire professional life reading power dynamics, mapping subtext, and identifying exactly where and how conflict shifts from disagreement to strategy. She recognized what was happening and knew what came next. Escalation through removal of agency. So before that final layer could tighten around her, she preemptively filed a formal complaint with the State Ethics Committee, not just about her case, but about the larger system of legal manipulation and manufactured conflict. She included documentation, sworn statements, the scheduling document accidentally sent to her, and a copy of the flagged insurance warning. She made it clear that she was not accusing a single person, but a structure, one built to neutralize resistance through economic exhaustion and social isolation. The complaint was carefully worded, stripped of emotion, built entirely on evidence and filed with legal oversight. She then filed a public report through a nonprofit housing rights watchdog, attaching her story and asking them to review the records for evidence of coordinated targeting. Her contact at the group, an analyst named Meena Patel, confirmed receipt and promised a deep audit of similar cases in the county. Within a week, Nancy heard from Meena again. Her case, it turned out, mirrored at least 7 others in adjacent neighborhoods, all involving different issues: fencing, easements, structural height, but following the same legal pattern. First a complaint, then isolation, then procedural shutdown, followed by community disinformation. But the most shocking development came that weekend. Nancy returned home from the grocery store to find a notice nailed, not taped, nailed, to her front door. It was from an anonymous Community Defense Alliance, claiming she was under citizen review for continued acts of disruption and citing pending community action. It wasn't legal, it wasn't sanctioned, and it wasn't even formally threatening. But it was unmistakably designed to invoke fear. The wood of her door was splintered slightly where the nail had been driven in. She stood in her entryway, bag of produce in hand, staring at the uneven sheet of paper for a full minute before tearing it down and walking inside. Her body didn't shake. She didn't cry. But a line inside her had hardened. Whatever was coming, they had just made one final mistake. They gave her a signal that she no longer needed to wait. They wanted to fracture her. Instead, they had given her grounds to force something bigger into motion. Her next move wouldn't be a letter or a phone call. It would be public, it would be precise, and it would be heard. Nancy had always believed that pressure reveals character. For weeks, she had been tested, stripped of her normal defenses, pushed into corners that had no windows, only mirrors reflecting the same cold reality. No one was coming to save her. But she had also stopped waiting for rescue. What they failed to account for, what no zoning board, no anonymous caller, no coward hiding behind procedural language had anticipated, was what happens when the person you try to bury learns how to dig out, not through force, but through precision. She'd watched every move, logged every inconsistency, and held her breath as wave after wave of manufactured conflict crashed against her door. Now it was her turn to act. Not react, act. The complaint she'd filed with the State Ethics Committee had reached the threshold for formal review. That meant certain documents, timelines, and communication logs would now be subject to compulsory release, not by the local review board, which had already shown its capacity for evasion, but by the state. This, in itself, wasn't a magic bullet, but it cracked the wall. It triggered a procedural oversight review, which in turn pulled in 2 state-level compliance officers tasked with quietly evaluating unusual enforcement patterns. Nancy knew this wasn't an audit. It wasn't flashy or immediate, but it was the start of a paper trail she didn't have to write herself. She didn't stop there. Leveraging her growing connection with Meena Patel's nonprofit network, Nancy gathered 6 homeowners from surrounding neighborhoods, all of whom had been targeted in similarly aggressive legal and zoning disputes. The group agreed to sign a joint declaration of shared procedural interference, submitting it to a legal watchdog firm that specialized in institutional overreach. One of the attorneys who reviewed the declaration requested a confidential interview. He had formerly served in a regional administrative capacity and recognized the case pattern not as a coincidence, but as a known tactic used to eliminate legal friction ahead of redevelopment proposals. According to him, investment firms would sometimes establish informal relationships with code enforcement committees or neighborhood boards. Nothing documented, nothing traceable, where favorable decisions could be encouraged through risk management, yield incentives. The goal wasn't always to seize property. Sometimes it was simply to pressure out vocal homeowners, especially those sitting on key parcels that interfered with future development. Nancy asked him directly, "Am I sitting on one of those parcels?" His answer, "If you weren't, you wouldn't be going through this." That was the final puzzle piece she needed. She dug into property transaction records, not just hers, but surrounding lots. Over the last year, a real estate investment trust with a deliberately generic name had acquired 4 homes within 2 blocks of hers. All had been sold below market value following disputes, 3 involving zoning compliance penalties. She cross-referenced the legal representatives in each of those cases and found 2 names repeating, one of which was the same firm representing the neighboring party in her injunction. The same firm that had tried to paint her greenhouse as a blight. With this, Nancy and Meena's team prepared an investigative dossier, not as a court filing, but as a media brief. No social media exposé, no viral stunt, just facts, timelines, names, and patterns presented to 3 regional news outlets with reputations for exposing bureaucratic manipulation. One reporter, intrigued by the clean documentation and alarming implications, agreed to begin background interviews. Nancy provided her logs. Meena connected her with 2 former review board members from other districts who'd resigned over similar tactics. Slowly, the gravity of her case expanded beyond one homeowner's ordeal. But the moment that sealed it, the moment Nancy knew her case was about to pierce through the wall of silence, came when she received a formal notice from the city attorney's office. Her appeal had not only been reopened, but was being elevated to independent arbitration under external review. This bypassed the local board entirely. More importantly, it triggered a public disclosure of internal board communications related to her case, many of which were now under scrutiny. Included in the notice was a statement acknowledging procedural irregularities in how her original citation was issued. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even an admission, but it was validation. It was movement. Her house remained quiet, but the energy had shifted. She was no longer defending a single structure. She was dismantling a tactic. And while retaliation didn't stop, it became clumsy. A second injunction attempt was filed by the same law firm, this time under a different client's name, someone who didn't live on her street and hadn't visited the neighborhood in over a year. The filing was denied almost immediately. The narrative control was slipping. Nancy stood on her porch that evening, the greenhouse lights glowing behind her like a quiet statement of defiance. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't declaring victory. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a single, measured breath of relief. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally shifted into the open. They had forced her to play defense. Now, finally, she was advancing. In the weeks that followed, the tone of everything changed. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but with a slow and unmistakable shift in posture, like a tide pulling back after weeks of pressing forward. The injunction was formally dismissed. The original violation citation against her greenhouse was voided with a statement citing procedural missteps and insufficient statutory clarity. And while the language was deliberately neutral, the outcome was clear. Nancy had won. Her property stood exactly as it was. The accusations, the threats, the legal gymnastics, all of it had collapsed under the weight of its own fabrication. And yet, Nancy didn't feel triumphant. What she felt was confirmation, not just that she had been right, but that the entire system had relied on her not having the stamina or structure to prove it. She had both, but it wasn't just her win. The cases she'd connected through Mina's team had begun receiving attention from legal oversight bodies. 2 members of a zoning advisory group quietly resigned. A formal ethics audit was launched. The investment firm tied to the property cluster began divesting from the area, citing community pushback. Nancy declined media interviews. She wasn't interested in becoming a face of resistance. What mattered more was what happened next. With the help of Dr. Salazar and Mina's legal contacts, she helped draft a procedural reform proposal to limit zoning board discretion during disputes and require third-party arbitration in any case where a pattern of complaint manipulation could be shown. The proposal, once dismissed as improbable, now had sponsors. As for her neighborhood, the smiles returned. Slower this time, less warm, but they came back. People realized what had been done to her. Some apologized quietly. Others simply nodded in passing. Nancy didn't hold grudges. She understood fear. She just refused to live in it. And when she sat alone in her greenhouse that first evening after the final paperwork cleared, she didn't think of what she had endured. She thought of how close she had come to losing her voice, and how powerful it felt to use it again.